I talked to a senator recently who put it this way. Listen, if I want to put forward a bill dealing with economic inequality, the working class and the like, all those special interests who want to stop what I want to do, all they have to do is jingle their pocket, AKA remind everyone that they have lots of money to make sure that other senators don't come on board.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalism, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
Since the election, there's been an endless shriek of what went wrong coming from the Democrats. A sampling that it was a backlash to wokeness, border immigration policies, DEI, contests over transgender acceptance, a general sense of social disorder, that Democrats abandon the working class, that inflation is coming for incumbents globally, so just don't overthink things, that the digital media ecosystem advantaged the right wing, that Republicans have just proven more adept at communicating to 21st century online followings. Everyone has a theory.
It's very important to understand what is the right version. In particular, it's important to understand whether it's true that Democrats have abandoned the working class and that somehow President Trump has been able to conquer it back.
Luigi, you just found a paper written by a group at Columbia that may offer some clues. So the goal of this paper was to disentangle what it calls demand factors, voters, from what it calls supply factors, politicians, in shaping political outcomes. And it tried to focus on the shift of blue-collar voters away from left-wing parties. And the paper ultimately concluded that parties were more polarized on cultural issues compared to economic issues, and that was the main driver of this partisan realignment.
The other thing that is interesting is one of the authors of the paper is Nicholas Longard Marx, the great-great-grandnephew of Karl Marx.
I did not know that. That is fascinating.
But what the paper tries to do, which I find it very interesting, is trying to understand to what extent the shift in various political positions of elected candidates is driven by voters' demands, and to what extent is driven by the platform chosen by the two major parties. The part that I'm not completely convinced by the paper is the fact that it takes this platform of the two parties as exogenous. What I would have done if I were him, I would have sort of say there are two factors. One is you need to get votes, and the other is you need to get money. You need to insist on certain characteristic of the voters in order to get votes. But if you distance yourself too much from the position of who has money, you don't get to run a campaign. My interpretation of these results is this movement of radicalization of the two parties on the ground of social issues is a compensation because they are so similar on some fundamental economic issues. So it's a bit like, those fake fight in the world of wrestling that you need to exaggerate the fight because, in fact, they're all friends. And the same is true, in my view, on the two parties. You radicalize and you kill each other on issue of abortion, gay rights. Why? Because they don't have monetary implications. On the stuff where there are big monetary implications, we all agree.
In order to explore this issue, we were thinking that the right person to have on the podcast is David Sirota, who has been writing about this, that this is the Democratic Party's core issue. He's written that the Democratic Party basically there's a circle full of policies that its corporate and billionaire donors want or can accept, and there's another circle full of initiatives that voters want. And during the campaign, the party typically eschews stuff that working class voters really want, but that might anger donors profiting off the status quo. Things like housing, health health care, higher wages, and, as he put it, other initiatives preventing corporations from grinding the non-rich into Soylent Green. So he went on to say that the party often chooses to campaign on items that overlap in both circles. David has actually pointed out this quote that Biden himself told wealthy political donors, informing them that his potential reelection and by extension the Democratic Party in power will mean nothing will fundamentally change for them. And so, in other words, I think, Luigi, per your point, the schizophrenic nature of the Democratic Party is in attempting to appease its wealthy donors while failing to communicate properly to the working class that was once its base.
So let's bring in David, who is an award-winning journalist and Oscar-nominated writer who served as the presidential campaign speechwriter for Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. David founded The Lever, an investigative news outlet, in 2020, and in 2022 he received an Academy Award nomination for the story for Netflix, Don't Look Up. Let me start with something that is at the same time very easy and very complicated. How money works in politics. Does it really play such a big role? Because I have a colleague of mine that say, there is a lot of money on both sides. Money cancels out and doesn't make a difference.
Well, first of all, if we accept the idea that the people who are giving money, then it would stand to reason that at least the people participating in that situation think they're getting something out of it. And the political policies that have come out of our government suggest that they are getting lots and lots of things. Now, is it a one-to-one relationship? In some cases it is. In lots of cases it isn't. When we look at political money, we have to ask, what are we describing as political money? Is it just campaign contributions, or is it contributions to super PACs additionally? Is it contributions to think tanks? Is it owning various media outlets? I would argue that all of these things collude to surround the policymaking apparatus with a set of choices that are what the givers, the donors, the investors really, what they want, and to essentially exclude and ignore what the public may want. So I think what has been constructed through money is a system that makes sure that most, if not all, of the policy choices considered realistic, legitimate, inside of the realm of possibility, almost all of those possibilities enrich one or another form of political investor. This is what creates the incoherence of the Democratic Party's message, right? The Democratic Party is caught between trying to position itself as hearing and responding to what the public wants, but also trying to deliver on what its donors want. And there's a very small set of issues in which the donors can accept what the public actually wants. They tend to be social issues, identity politics issues, and the like, issues where essentially the oligarchy doesn't have a financial stake in those issues. But once it comes to economic issues, where in many cases it's a zero-sum game, billionaires can make this much money or they can face a tax rate where they make a little less, you have to choose a side. That's why Democrats often, to my mind, sound so incoherent.
I was thinking about another category of money, and I'd love to hear your reaction to it, which is the money that hasn't been spent yet, the hope of getting money. And I think this might tie into your idea of the Democrats' donor appeasement strategy. And it means that huge pots of money influence what politicians do in ways that can't be tied to the money that's already been spent.
And I think there's actually two pots of unspent money. There's the threatening pot of unspent money, and then there's the rewarding pot of unspent money. I talked to a senator recently who put it this way. Listen, if I want to put forward a bill dealing with economic inequality, the working class and the like, all those special interests who want to stop what I want to do, all they have to do is jingle their pocket, AKA remind everyone that they have lots of money, to make sure that other senators don't come on board. And what he's really talking about is when these senators or congresspeople or governors are up for re-election, the thing they're really afraid of is that a giant super PAC will intervene in their election to try to spend them into the ground. And we've seen that happen. We've seen, the crypto industry most recently spend a ton of money in races across the country to try to punish those who criticize or are even just vaguely perceived to be an opponent of the crypto industry, that money has been spent. And that money is an investment both in preventing those potential critics from getting reelected, but also to send a message to all future candidates and all current incumbents. Hey, if you mess with us, we will come into your reelection race to try to stop you. So they don't have to spend the next time around certain amounts of money because they've already sent the threat. So that's the threatening form. The rewarding form is obviously the revolving door. If you serve big money in Congress, there is now an expectation that you will get a personal financial payout. And we see that all the time. I mean, look, we just see it most recently. You've seen it with Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. They've both been essentially rewarded with big, presumably very lucrative jobs in the industries that were lobbying Congress when they were obstructing various pieces of legislation on behalf of those industries.
Who do you blame for this, the donors or the politicians? In other words, and is it as simple as a matter of blame, or is it just in a system that is problematic, it's impossible to single out who's to blame?
Well, look, I think they're both to blame, but I would say this, that there have been multiple times in the past where the people in power could have fixed this system, could have made money a little less dominant than it currently is, and they have said no. And so what are some of those fixes? To my mind, some of the fixes, and none of this is perfect, but some of the fixes are much better disclosure, so the public has a very basic and robust right to know at least who is spending money. More strongly, there hasn't been a public financing system of elections. To my mind, the lack of one is the central problem. We have a system in which if you're going to run competitively for office in the United States, you need to raise a significant amount of money to pay to communicate with voters. So a public financing system would say, listen, if you do certain things, if you raise certain amounts of small dollars from, not huge donors, if you get enough signatures and the like, you get access to a pot of public money that doesn't come with legislative strings attached. Various states, some cities have done this. Again, it's not perfect, but we have not done this at the national level. Congress a couple times has gotten actually pretty close to doing it, but has never done it. At one point, they did it for presidential elections, but the pot of money wasn't big enough, and essentially inflation sort of harmed its efficacy. And there's none at the congressional level. So we have baked into the system the idea that you have to go ask for larger and larger amounts of money from industries and oligarchs who want favors. So right now, we have the best government that those donors can buy. And I know the arguments against public financing. It's, why do we want to use taxpayer money to pay for politicians' ads and pay for politicians' campaigns? It's like, well, I guess I get that argument, but if you're not going to have that, what you're going to end up having is a privately financed system that mostly serves the private financiers.
My impression is that it's actually even more sophisticated than that, because a lot of the campaign by the Democrats is maneuvered by a bunch of consultants who are actually better off if the Democrats lose, but the donors keep giving the money, that the Democrats win, but without the money of the donors, because their role is really providing support in name of the donors. And if the donors go away, their job goes away. So a colleague of mine told me the story that he was giving a couple of advices to the campaign of Kamala Harris. So he suggested to actually campaign on abolishing non-compete clauses. As we know, Lina Khan proposed the abolition by decree. That was blocked by a judge. But this is not a constitutional issue. So if Congress decides to abolish the non-compete, Congress has the power to do so. If there's a will to do so, has the power to do so. And so gave this advice to one of these consultants. This consultant did a survey, and the survey suggested that, surprise, surprise, a lot of people are in favor of this idea, and not only generic Democrat, but also people on the margin. The people might be more likely to vote for Kamala Harris if she were to campaign on the issue of abolishing non-compete. That, by the way, will sound perfect with Kamala for the people, and so everything. Have you ever seen this campaign coming out of Kamala?
No. Right. Nope.
Are you cynical enough to argue that the Democrats' focus on a lot of social justice issues is not necessarily because they believe it, but is a giant, not necessarily a head fake, but a form of camouflage to avoid the focus on the real issues?
You know, I
Not the real issues, that's the wrong way of putting it, but to avoid focus on the economic issues because they're all real issues.
so I can put both of what you've just said into context. I mean, yes, there is this idea that the consultant class is giving Democrats specific pieces of advice and guiding the party effectively towards certain issues and away from other issues, in part because the consultant class gets rich either way, whether the Democrats win or lose. A lot of consultants are doing simultaneous work with corporate clients and politicians, and they don't want to necessarily anger their corporate clients. But I would say this. I don't think the typical Democratic consultant is trying to lose elections. To your question, Bethany, I don't think the Democrats don't believe in social issues. What I would say is the money incentivizes them to highlight, stress, and spotlight the issues that don't offend capital, right? Whether or not that means imperiling winning the election.
Do you think that there's any way to change this? We wrote the Democratic Party is terrible at most things. It's very good at one thing, which is crushing dissent, crushing any kind of push for change within its own midst. Is there a way past this?
I think there is a way past this, although I've been saying that for a while. Maybe I'm just an eternal optimist. I mean, look, I wrote a book in 2007, 2008, in which the basic premise was called The Uprising, that look, there's this populist rage in the country. It's going to go one way or the other. And I had hoped at the time, now looks rather naive, but I had hoped, and I use the word hope, specifically, I had hoped that the Obama campaign had seen its FDR moment. And he campaigned, everyone forgets this now, he campaigned on a really populist, progressive economic message. And he got elected with a huge mandate in the middle of at least this generation's version of the Great Depression moment. And in my view, he squandered that. The Democratic Party, even with large congressional majorities, ended up passing a lot of giveaways to the banks, essentially took hope and change, made it into more of the same. Gutted weak financial regulations, 10 million people getting thrown out of their homes. Guess what? A backlash happens, the Tea Party happens, setting the stage for Donald Trump, and here we are. So I say that all to say that we have been here before, and it has not gone well. My hope is that we are now living through a moment in which the Democratic Party is learning that this is not a sustainable path. Now, the counter argument would be it's a sustainable path for the Democratic consulting class and the existing politicians who still are elected in the Democratic Party because they're still there. They don't really care. But I do think we are potentially at a pivot point, and here's why I say that. One, I actually do think that the Biden administration learned some lessons from the failures of the Obama administration. I actually think on various economic issues that the Biden administration was much better and had learned those lessons when it comes to antitrust enforcement, labor enforcement, the American Rescue Plan, when you compare that to the stimulus during the financial crisis. I mean, this is universes better. Now, obviously, I'm worried that, Biden, staying in the race when he shouldn't have, Democrats losing, that will be weaponized by the corporate wing of the Democratic Party to say, this shows the failure of Biden's agenda. I think that's misreading what actually happened in reality. I think the political bungling in 2024 is kind of astounding and horrifying and maddening to think about. But so that's one point of the policy realization. I think also now, for the first time, really in my lifetime that I can remember, you see polls showing that the base of the Democratic Party, the rank and file electorate of the Democratic Party, is enraged at its own leadership. That is very, very good. It is long overdue. I mean, it's shocking how long it took to get here. But that kind of foment is not sustainable for the current leadership of the Democratic Party. So the question is, and I don't have an answer to this, can the existing Democratic establishment, does it still have enough power to now crush down a widespread anger inside of the party? You saw it crush the Bernie Sanders campaigns in 2016 and 2020. You've seen that establishment use lots of money to stop grassroots populist primary challenges. You see, even this week, some voices, for instance, saying that some of these Midwest and so-called Rust Belt Democrats who are still winning the working class, that they should be primaried because they are saying that while Trump's tariffs are bad, we should not say that our trade policy is good. There's a congressman from Pennsylvania, Chris Deluzio, a populist progressive congressman from Western Pennsylvania, who's making this argument. And that has elicited people saying, oh, he's a Trump appeaser. He's trying to help the Republicans. We need to primary him. That is the sort of now Bush Republican, sort of corporate country club Republican wing of the Democratic Party, trying to use Trump's tariffs to say we've essentially got to purge the party of anybody who has any criticism of America's NAFTA-style corporate-written trade policy. So this civil war is happening, and I don't know which side yet is going to win, but I do know that anger throughout the party at the leadership is a point of opportunity.
It's certainly a point of opportunity, but let me play the devil's advocate for the sake of it. But there is also a huge opportunity for the Democratic Party to move even more to the center, capture all the former Republicans who are disappointed with President Trump policies. Certainly there are some votes, and there is a lot of money. How can you prevent this from happening from your point of view?
No, it's a good question. Look, in 2024, the Democrats in various states tried to prioritize, for instance, campaigning with Liz Cheney. Hey, we're the normal party. We're about democracy. We have to attract disaffected Republicans. And the exit polls have shown us that didn't really work as a strategy in terms of moving over disaffected Republicans. That said, I think that was a more difficult tactic when Trump wasn't the president. So the argument was a little less salient. So I do think there's a cadre in the party right now that is like, look, let's just keep our heads down. Let's move to the right when we can. Let's not embrace any kind of structural change in our economic message at all, because all we got to do is wait this out. There's going to be a lot of destruction, and we can just campaign as the return to normalcy. We don't actually have to change anything. So I think that's certainly possible. But I also think this is going to be in 2028, you're going to have an open presidential primary, and a lot of people are going to run. And so a lot of people are going to try to create their own lanes. I think some of these candidates will try to take the lane of I'm the establishment, I'm normal. They'll run the Biden 2020. That was what the Biden 2020 campaign was, right? I'll return everything to normalcy. And they'll have a lot of money. But let's not forget, Bernie Sanders' campaign in both 2016 and 2020 came pretty close to winning. And I'm not like dissing Bernie. I worked for him in 2020. I worked for him 30 years ago. Listen, if a senator from Vermont who kind of looks like Larry David, who is a self-identified socialist, right, can almost win the Democratic Party's nomination without, big donors and the like. Imagine what somebody with a slightly different positioning, but with the exact same message could potentially do. And my view is that the money guys in the Democratic Party know that. They must be like, wow, we got really lucky. And I use the historical analogy of Barry Goldwater. I am not comparing Bernie Sanders' message with Barry Goldwater's. Barry Goldwater's is a genuinely extreme message. I don't think Bernie Sanders had an extreme message. But the point is, an ideological, clear, principled message. He actually wins the primary, loses in the general, but it took 16 years for a different kind of Barry Goldwater with more political assets to take Barry Goldwater's campaign essentially and win the presidency. My guess is that in 1964, people were eye rolling, right? I mean, there was talk about, this is the end of the Republican Party. They're never going to be a party again. That's it. It's over. Like they got destroyed. It was the biggest landslide in history. 16 years later, you have Ronald Reagan. So I think in one scenario, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm saying this is one scenario. Bernie Sanders is the Barry Goldwater figure of the center left in America, of the Democratic Party. And I'm not sure who the Reagan version of it is, but I certainly think it's possible.
Would it be enough? Say you had a candidate who came up with exactly the right slate of issues to address working class woes, but continued with the democratic social platforms that we've seen. There's some research suggesting that people do vote more on social platforms than they do on economic ones. And even if these voters you've talked about who left the Democratic Party didn't necessarily believe in the social platforms, were more conservative, but finally broke with the Democratic Party over their economic positions. But unfortunately, or unfortunately, it doesn't work in reverse. Just because then the Democratic Party gets back on board with the right economic platform, does that mean that those voters are willing to look past the social platform that they don't agree with?
A lot of this is how much, where your focus is. You can be incidentally progressive on identity issues, social issues, but each politician at some level has a decision to make on how they define themselves. Now, I say that with an asterisk because a lot of big money ends up defining politicians in ways that they don't want to be defined. They've tried not to define themselves. So this is what makes it difficult. What we're really talking about is, can the Democratic Party change its brand orthodoxy to be known primarily, I want to underscore that, primarily as the economic populist party, as opposed to being known as primarily prioritizing social and cultural issues.
So again, let me challenge a bit what you're saying, because if you go to Latin America, you find that it's very difficult for moderate leftist or sane leftist candidate to win. You either have somebody that is really, really mainstream, or you have extremist on the left. And my interpretation of it is that when there is a lot of money at stake, or in that case, particularly influence of the United States at stake, etc., it's very difficult for you to be just a little bit away from where the money is. So the reason why, paradoxically, it was easier to Bernie Sanders succeed is because Bernie Sanders was so extreme that it could raise a lot of money from individual people. So the big obstacle, in my view, is in the primaries, especially early on, you need to have a broad support. And either you are a celebrity, either you find Oprah Winfrey or some very popular person that is able to capture regardless, or you don't survive the money primary because there will be a candidate, a moderate candidate, let's say Pete Buttigieg, who is going to be so appealing to a lot of donors, and he's going to find it irresistible to get the money of those donors. And then if you fight against Pete Buttigieg, you don't fight by being a little bit more populist than Pete Buttigieg. You have to go all the way. But then if you go all the way, then especially in the second round, everybody's going to pound against you, and your chance of winning is going to be very limited. So do you see a way out of this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this. Again, I don't think about this in terms of candidate centric. I think about this in terms of what are the candidates campaigning on. So this is maybe my most cynical view. I don't really care necessarily what a particular candidate believes in their heart. Oh, what does he believe? What does Pete Buttigieg? That's a good example. This sort of very difficult to discern what Pete Buttigieg, and I'm not picking on him, but he's very difficult to discern what he actually believes. This is a guy who literally as a kid wrote an essay about how Bernie Sanders is like the greatest politician in the world, and then ran a primary saying that we can't do Medicare for all, Bernie's agenda is extreme, etc. So I have no idea. What I care about with all of these politicians is what incentives do they see? What formula for their own success and ambition do they see? What lane do they see in order to get elected and in order to remain in power? Because that will tell you what they will really be loyal to. If Pete Buttigieg runs a super populist campaign because he thinks that's the way to win the Democratic primary and win the election, what that will reflect is that the work inside of the party and the sort of society at large is interested in rewarding candidates who campaign on that kind of agenda. And then that politician who wins, in theory, can be held to that agenda. Now, obviously, a politician can get elected. I mean, we went through Obama. He sold out. And to my mind, that destroyed the social contract. It created all sorts of backlash. And that was, frankly, a generational tragedy. It created all sorts of cynicism and disillusionment. But I think the best we can hope for is that the dynamics have changed where even the most mercenary politicians feel like they have to run on a working class economic agenda and then deliver on that for their own success. And I'll just leave you with an example on that, right? LBJ on civil rights, LBJ was an opponent of civil rights because the society had changed, because there was so much political organizing over so much time. LBJ felt he had to change on that issue. It's because LBJ is not because he's a good guy, like in the goodness of his own heart. It's because he was a consummate political operator and saw that he had to change his formula.
I had a last question for you, David, which is going to sound like I'm delving into the details, except I think it does in some ways encapsulate some of what we're talking about here. And that's the topic of the day, tariffs. How do you see tariffs through the lens of what we're discussing?
Oh boy. I mean, look, I spent a lot of time when I worked on Capitol Hill for Bernie Sanders. This is now late 90s, early 2000s. I spent a lot of time on the trade issue. This is when the China PNTR deal was moving through Congress. It was incredibly divisive. I think that what's gone on is it's really a tragedy. It's an economic tragedy, the deindustrialization of the country, et cetera, et cetera. Some of us who are that old have been saying for really decades at this point, if the Democratic Party doesn't get right on this issue, certainly not doing what Trump is doing, and I'll get to that in a second. But if it becomes the party of pure so-called free trade, which is really corporate written trade, it's free trade for labor and environmental standards, it's super protectionist trade for IP and copyrights, et cetera, et cetera. If the Democratic Party doesn't figure this out, there is going to be a simmering backlash that will ultimately explode. Donald Trump, by the way, figured that out in 2016. He figured it out in the 90s. He was flirting with running under Ross Perot's party in 2000. So this is actually something that Donald Trump has known about for a very long time. And I think what we're experiencing now is the culmination of that 30-year backlash in what I liken to like a jokerized version of what politics should be. In my view, Donald Trump's tariffs are not strategic. They're not really a trade policy. They're a power grab. They're him trying to assert control over the economy, to essentially get countries, corporations to give him favors, do what he wants because they have to kiss the ring of the king. It is not a serious trade policy designed to rebuild manufacturing in this country. And I think that the timing of it actually gives away the game, right? Because if you're serious about using tariffs, even across the board tariffs, one thing you probably want to do is say, listen, if we're going to put across the board tariffs in place, we're going to phase them in or create a timetable to put them in to give industries the chance to invest to produce the things in this country that we say we want to be produced here. Waking up one day and deciding that today is Liberation Day and just throwing up tariffs without any kind of timetable or any kind of plan at all, not part of an industrial policy. Again, this is destructive. It's going to, I believe it's going to harm the economy. I certainly don't think it's going to help the working class. But I will just say this, one last point. It is tapping into real, legitimate, and authentic anger at the deindustrialization policies of NAFTA, China PNTR, and the like. And Democrats using this situation, the bad Trump tariffs, the sort of reckless, out of control Trump tariffs, to say that we shouldn't ever talk about tariffs, that free trade was good, NAFTA was great, China PNTR was great. My view is that that's what Trump wants to happen, that this is part of a political trap that he wants to try to set, to say, oh, I want the Democrats arguing that essentially hollowing out the entire industrial heartland was actually good. And so I think this is a perilous, it's obviously a perilous moment for the economy, but I think it's a perilous moment for Trump because of what's going on in the economy. But I also think there's peril here for Democrats.
I agree with what you're saying, but I fear that this might actually benefit Trump politically. As you said, they might please an electoral base who is very resentful. And the more they see all the intellectual elite screaming murder, because they are losing their 401k. They say, you know what? We don't have a 401k. We have lost everything we have. This is a revenge moment. Do we really think that this is going to make President Trump less popular?
I agree that the stock market is not a comprehensive, real reflection of the real lived economy. But I think there is something that is the macro economy, and that if prices go up in a dramatic way, if people can't afford things, if this tips us over into a recession or at least recession-like conditions. Typically, presidents, when they face re-election in those situations, they don't electorally survive. Now, there's a whole question about whether Donald Trump's just never going to have an election again. That's a whole separate other podcast. But I definitely agree with you that there is class resentment politics going on here. I think the question is, and I don't have an answer for it, is how far do pure class resentment politics go if the policy tool you're using to try to inflame that ends up harming the macro economy that affects everybody?
I would like to ask you a very difficult question I don't know the answer of, but why is it much easier to do populist policy from the right than it is from the left? Because imagine a scenario in which Kamala Harris was elected and did 1/5 of what Trump is doing now. I think we're going to have a revolt of the well-to-do class. And while there are a lot of people who are upset, we don't see that revolt. Why?
It's a great question. And I saw somebody characterize this, the example you're making, saying, listen, if Bernie Sanders had been elected president and did across-the-board tariffs and the stock market tanked by 10% in 48 hours, there would be calls for a military coup. I mean, they were joking, but not exactly joking, right? It's like, okay. And it's a great question. And I think that over decades and decades, really almost a century at this point, this idea that to do anything populist from the left is essentially communism or socialism. So it's got it's so many generations of linking the idea of left of center populism with communism, essentially. When Bernie Sanders runs as a kind of center left, I wouldn't even call his agenda, leftist, a center left agenda, he's billed as he's the next Castro, right? But Donald Trump does across the board tariffs. And it's like, it's baked in, oh, well, he's a business guy, right? I mean, he was a CEO. So he still has the capitalist class's desires in his mind. So it's portrayed as through, big media as, well, it may be a little crazy and it may be bad and there may be some criticism of it, but it's not Fidel Castro, right? And it's at this point, it's a completely outdated frame. It's a completely destructive frame, because when you really think about this country's history, when we really built things, when America really was great in terms of, make America great again, it was when we had the most left of center president probably that we've ever had, doing a real populist agenda, right? The New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? And I do think there's this part of the American psyche that has sort of wiped that away from the memory in service of, a kind of right-wing narrative that says anything that's left of center populism is communism.
Well, thank you so much. This has been so interesting and fantastic, and it's such a pleasure to get the chance to talk to you.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Not Another Politics Podcast. Not Another Politics Podcast provides a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories. It's not told through opinions and anecdotes, but rather through rigorous scholarship, massive data sets, and a deep knowledge of theory. So if you want to understand the political science behind the political headlines, then listen to Not Another Politics Podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network.
I think that the question I have, which I don't know the answer of, is to what extent this is a bit of a self-serving argument that the left of the Democratic Party uses, because if you are trying to push for your agenda, you're always saying that the time has come for your agenda to go through. And to what extent this is true. Now, there are some interesting factoids. For example, when you look at referenda, the referenda seem to indicate that people are much more leftist on economic issues. For example, the minimum wage got approved in many places, even in places that are traditionally Republican. But I don't know whether this can carry forward and to say, imagine that tomorrow we have a novel Bernie Sanders presidential candidate will be able to win a national election.
Yeah, it strikes me that this is a journalist perspective, but when I think about the history of the last couple of decades and what I've seen, it seems to me that people want progressive economic policies in different ways, meaning that there might be a strong movement behind a minimum wage. There might at the same time be a strong resistance to what people who want to be self-sufficient perceive as a giveaway, even if that giveaway would benefit them. And then there might be, after the fact, a love for said giveaway that means people don't want to see it taken away, like the famous quote from a couple of campaigns ago, hands off my Medicaid. And the same thing with Obamacare. Now, for all its failings, people do not want to see it taken away, despite the fact that its passage was really contested, and by some of the people for whom you would think it would help. I don't know that economic policies always translate to the people they're supposed to benefit in a way that is rational and logical.
Let me rephrase slightly what you said, maybe in a more academic
Go for it.
form, which is maybe a bad form, but let me try. What I think you said is workers might respond a bit less to changes in their policy in their favor than more wealthy individuals. Wealthy individuals know immediately whether his or her taxes went up, but a worker might not know whether there is a provision in the trade treaty that eventually will dispose of his or her job. So there is a problem of communications that to some extent we have seen with the Biden policy, because whether you like or not the former president, but he did choose a much more populist agenda in many issues. But this did not sort of pay off in any way at the electoral booth. And so you can argue that there is no constituency for that, or that there is constituency but was not properly communicated. But I tend to be allergic when people say it's all a communication problem, because it's kind of a easy way to escape your responsibility, to say, oh, I'm right, but I didn't communicate properly.
Yeah, it's not because workers are necessarily less sophisticated than the well-off. It's actually just because they might be more sophisticated, but it's far more complicated for them. In other words, the well-off get richer if the stock market goes up and if their taxes are lowered. And so the policies are, at least in the short term, are a little more straightforward. Whereas for somebody in a blue-collar job whose job might be taken away by trade policy, that's way more complicated to understand. And even economists have shown, I love to attack economists, don't I? Even economists have shown an inability to predict exactly how those things are going to play out. But what you said also raises another question. And if it were as simple as, and he doesn't say it's simple, but if David were right, wouldn't you have seen more appreciation for what Biden was trying to do? Or is it just that no matter what, cultural issues resonate more and strike to people's guts more somehow than economic ones do, and that the economic policies were and always will be overshadowed by the cultural ones?
I don't think that necessarily economic policy are overshadowed by cultural one. Remember Carville that said, it's the economy stupid. So economic issues are important, but they need to be, per your point, which was excellent, you said before, they need to be very salient. If they're not salient, it's much more difficult to recognize. And I think that for all the work that was done at the FTC, at the Federal Trade Commission, and at the Department of Justice regarding antitrust, there wasn't a lot to show people their money's worth. One of the biggest initiatives, in my view, that Lina Khan took that would have been very directly affecting people is this issue of non-compete. For many of our listeners, you're probably not aware that 1 every 5 jobs in America as a restriction that if you leave the job, you can't do a similar job in a very close geographical area. And we're not talking only about super sophisticated scientist job, but even at McDonald's. So if you work at McDonald's, you can't go and work at Wendy for a certain number of months or years, as if you're stealing such important trade secrets. So that issue, I think, will have been an issue that captures people's imagination, but her decree on the issue was blocked by a judge, and so people did not see the impact of that in real time.
Right. And whereas I think Sirota would agree with this, what the donor class did see and did not like were the impact of a couple of things in that hurt them. So you see the tech industry's temper tantrum because they were being told they couldn't make money in all the ways that they wanted to. And the private equity and hedge fund and investor class was furious that her policies were, in their view, preventing mergers and acquisitions and preventing their buyout funds from being rescued by being able to sell a portfolio company to another company. And that would be an echo or further evidence that Sirota's point is right, because the donor class got mad.
But where I'm not 100% convinced by David is how you get out of this.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he's 100% convinced either, by the way. I would have loved it if he had been able to offer a clear roadmap for how at least these issues become the issues that decide elections, because they are the pivotal ones. And I'm not sure he sees the path out either.
In a sense, his view is if these are the issues in which people win and lose election, everybody will conform. And at some level, I agree. The question is, imagine that the new election were tomorrow. Do you see the Democrat campaigning on a populist agenda? Or do you see the Democrats campaigning on, we're going to bring back sort of the world of yesterday?
Normalcy. They would not campaign on any kind of progressive economic policy or any kind of change in policy. And you can, I think, see some of that in the hue and cry over tariffs. There aren't many pieces, and maybe I'm missing them and I haven't read enough, but I don't think there's very much out there that takes a nuanced position on tariffs and that really tries to take into account the fact that the Biden administration left the Trump administration's first round of tariffs in place, and that there are tariffs that there are some tariffs that might make sense in the context of a broader industrial policy, and that the Democrats' rabid embrace of free trade over the last couple of decades did a lot of damage. Instead, you have this just tariffs are bad, and I think some part of that, in fairness, is that there doesn't seem to be much coherent strategy behind Trump's tariffs. But I think some part of that is also reflects a longing for a return just to the way things were, and an unwillingness or a lack of desire to try to confront a world that might be more complex than people once believed. In other words, it's not just as simple as free trade is good. So I do think that while tariffs are in a way a micro issue of what we're talking about and very much in the headlines today, they're also symbolic of this whole discussion.
As David said, there is at least one Democrat, De Lucio, that is trying to carve out a position that is, I don't agree with the Trump administration, but not all tariffs are bad. But that's a very difficult position to carve out in this moment. And my limited understanding of social media, etc., De Lucio is completely pounded both from the right and the left. So not really a very pleasant position to be in.
Yeah, I actually started to think about this, but even in the early days of the Biden administration, when the carried interest tax was taken off the table, and I thought, wait, who's pulling the strings here? And I think that is disturbing, to say the least.
Yeah, and to be honest, so was any antitrust legislation. Remember when for 2 years the Democrats control everything, and they promise us all sort of change, but the only change we saw was in the administration and the FTC and the DOJ, but not in Congress. We were unable in Congress to pass any law on the issue.
Capitalism is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Leah Cesarine, with production assistance from Utsof Gandhi, Matt Lucky, Sebastian Burka, Andy Shee, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to take our conversation further, also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center, and subscribe to our newsletter. Sign up at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler to discover exciting new content, events, and insights. We hope you'll join our community, again at chicagobooth.edu/Stiegler.